You're listening to Beyond the Sermon, the podcast of First Methodist Church in Collingswood, New Jersey. On our podcast, the goal is not just to share our sermons, but to go beyond the sermon and talk about what we're learning and what God is doing in us and in our community. The sermon you're about to listen to comes from our Fall 2023 sermon series, The God Who Rescues. In this series, we're walking with the Israelites from Egypt to Mount Sinai, looking at how God redeems and forms a people for himself. You can find more information about our church at fumccollingswood.org. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. So Jeremy, this weekend you were able to take the young adults on a retreat up to the Poconos, and so you all missed the sermon on Sunday, even though I'm sure you went back and listened to it on the way home or something like that. But
not with the wind noise in that church van, we did not.
But I was just wondering, like, what's something good that God did while you guys were up in the Poconos this weekend?
I'll share a few because they're kind of all in different areas. One, it seemed like there was a shared consensus that just rest, like a good Sabbath, was needed. We had a couple people just took naps during free times. By all means, we weren't really stinging about when we had to wake up except Sunday because we had to get back home. But so Saturday, people want to sleep till 9:30, 10, by all means. And then, so rest, being in God's nature and being surrounded, we'd walk out to grab something from the car 20 feet away, or 3 baby deer just sitting in the grass. And I got, pictures of them in the yard. We look outside at night and there's one just laying in the front yard. And so that, and the it's already basically at peak foliage change up there right now.
Yeah.
So it was all over the ground. There was red and yellow and green, and all the colors changing was really beautiful. So just to be surrounded by his creation and seeing the Milky Way at night from the lake when we took a little brisk walk. It's 40 degrees at that point. And then in our sessions, got to see an intimacy with God individually. And so that was great for myself, but could see without words, without, even talking to them about it, you could see just a really focused, intimate time with God. And for each person that could look different and present in different ways, but to see someone just sit with the scriptures for 45 minutes and then partner up and kind of discuss how God touched their hearts, it was really, really encouraging. And our last session, kind of like our worship service, we don't really do worship the whole week, and we had Aaron kind of sing a song and us meditate on the lyrics before we got into sessions.
Yeah.
And then Sunday it's participatory praise and worship, and talking about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, specifically the Matthew account where he takes a few of the disciples with him, right? And then they stay back while he goes and has that personal time with God.
Right.
But that doesn't mean he's not supported by brothers even in his personal time. And you think it's personal, so that's just you.
Sure.
But to have that support, and then we wanted to set up some accountability partners, and so to have Jesus kind of come back to them, be you couldn't stay awake for an hour.
Yeah.
And for me, we kind of shifted that to you don't have an hour in your week for this to focus on God. Out of all the other things we give an hour or 23 minutes or 48 minutes or whatever it might be, an hour and a half, we don't have an hour for this. And then the second time in the Matthew account, he goes back to them after praying to God, take this cup of suffering from me, not my will, but your will be done. Comes back the second time, they're still asleep. He doesn't say anything. He just lets them keep sleeping. And he goes back, and Lord, take this cup of suffering, not my will, but your will be done. And then he comes back and goes, okay, you can rest and sleep, but the time has come.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was just the beauty of Christ-like accountability can be, of not only the reminder of this time is important that you spend with God, that I spend with God. And then, you know what? I don't need to bring it up every time I see you falling short. And then the third time, I'm not telling you to get back in the Word and read, but you need to remember the mission and what we have coming up and what's going on here.
Yeah.
And so it's like, you can rest, you can do the stuff, but like, it's happening in the here and now. And so giving that like reminder of urgency, but rest and sleep if that is what you really need at this moment. And then having like, we had a good prayer time before we got into our small groups of just like thinking of whatever sufferings we might be going through now, the emotional, physical, spiritual, whatever it might be, social sufferings, and asking God to relieve us of those things, but ultimately desiring His will over our own. And so I think that's a great practice for every listener to maybe take a few minutes, pause this, and take a few minutes and do that, because it really is was really, really helpful. And, I can't kind of speak too much to how fruitful it was to others, besides just some comments immediately after the retreat of like, this is really needed, and God really met me on this weekend. And so that's just
and that's stuff that hopefully in the days to come, the weeks to come, you guys, as you're sharing on Wednesday nights at young adults and that they're sharing together in Sunday school, like hopefully some of that will begin to come out as people take what they heard over the weekend and figure out, what's this actually look like when I'm back in my day to day.
And that was really the intention. And I told him, like, there's no secret agendas here. I really wanted this to be how we can, that's why we called it rhythms. Like, how do we, when we're not in retreat mode and are back in our daily rhythms, how do we include God in those daily rhythms and have people to hold us accountable? And I think that time, as we talk over and over and over and over and over again on this podcast, is that those daily things, that daily walk personally, I think will outflow and outpour into our time together as the young adults community within the church, and then ultimately into FUMC and into the rest of God's church. And so, I'm very, very excited to see how God continues to use all of it. And so it's a lot of driving. It was good. 3-hour drive, but well worth it. And Annie Ann's and Cinnabon at the Allentown rest stop always help us get through. Nice.
So a moment of accountability. Have you actually listened to the sermon from Sunday? Yeah.
I listened to it this morning. And when Theo fell asleep on me in my bed after he just woke up, he was up for like maybe 20, 30 minutes. And then he just fell asleep in my arms, and I wasn't going to get up. So, nice. I mean, he fell asleep to your sermon. Right. So, of course. Which checks for Theo.
Not just Theo. Yeah. So what questions came up in your mind?
No.
Okay.
Well, I'll start off with
podcast.
I know that having the missions moment, sometimes you try to be intentional about shortening sermon to a lot for that time. But is there anything that, if you had just an extra 5 minutes, either you would have expanded upon or really like leaned into or added into your sermon?
I think in hindsight, I wish I had taken a bit more time, or had more time to take even, at the end of the sermon. Like, I didn't cut out a lot early on, but then at the end of it, I felt kind of rushed, and maybe like I didn't flesh out the application and like what it means to us today, quite as much as maybe I wish I had. Just, not that I would have said more or like changed what the challenge was, but just to be able to give that a little more practicality or application.
Can you give that to me now? Give me a little...
No, I'm not in the flow of preaching. But what does it look like for us to prioritize the presence of God? And what does it look like to... What's it look like to be willing to let Him break down those idols? And, one of my boys at lunch said, that story reminded me, like, later in that chapter, doesn't Moses, like, grind up the golden calf and put it in water and make him drink it? It's like, yeah, he did. It's like, that's like,
So put your iPhone in a blender and
will it win? But just like, I wish I had fleshed that out a little more of what that could look like and how we can build those practices in that help us to, with our actions, show the priority that we're making God, not just saying it with our lips.
Yeah. And I think that's different for every person, what that practical step
For
looks
sure.
like. Excuse me. And that's where I think having accountability partners helps, because then you can discuss, like we discussed in our retreat, of what's an area that you know you need to be working on in your relationship with God. What's something practical and realistic that you can do to make that more of a priority? And then what's the best communication method for your accountability partner to like contact you about that?
Check in.
And each person was, even in the little group that we split up into, was like, one person was like, alarms help me. And the other person was like, I don't need alarms. I have this very specific time. I know that I do it at this time, and I go into it. But when I go into it, it feels ritualistic, and I don't know how to get out of the ritual. Like, it just feels like another chore on the to-do list, and I don't feel like I'm spending time with God. I feel like I'm doing a chore for God.
Checking a box.
And so each person was different. Some people were text, some people were call, some people were, and so, but to have partners like that in life to help us with that. Now, Scott, in the beginning of your sermon, you talked about desiring the ability to fly. And I feel like if you were able to do that, you would need some accountability, because like freedom, or at least that, I feel like that's the core of the desire to fly, is the freedom to go where you desire with lack of things holding you back, besides like pigeons flying in your face. What do you anticipate, if you were to have the ability of flying, what would that entail? Like, are you thinking like lightning speed, like the Flash, even though he doesn't fly, but like when him and Superman race, are you anticipating around the world in 30 seconds? Are you anticipating there to be like a mental focus required, a physicality to it, like running, where you need to build up how far and how fast you can fly? Like, what do you think that actually looks like if we were able to do so?
Yeah, so I think for me, it's not so much about the speed, more the effortlessness of it. Like when I see a hawk soaring in the sky, like it just happens. It just like they just do it. It doesn't. There's not that frantic flapping of the wings. Or I know they have to get started and get up there and all that. But like once they're up there, like they just go. And it's not even necessarily about getting to somewhere as much as it, I don't know. I think for me, it's that shift of perspectives that is so intriguing to me.
Well, then let me put something. Sorry.
Oh, and I think about times like when I've been hiking on a mountain or the AT or whatever, and you get up to a spot where you just look out and you're up above. Sometimes, you're even watching birds soar beneath you, and just the shift of perspectives that brings to the way you see a location or an area. This is always captured. I love looking down out of the windows from a plane, and
he likes looking down at people, is what we're getting to.
That's exactly what it is.
But yeah, and so one of the easier questions is, do you have, when you're talking about idols and things that people were like, oh, Moses probably died, and God's not doing what we want when we want, so we're going to create this idol to worship. Is there an example that comes to mind when you think of a time when God didn't do what you wanted, or you didn't feel like waiting for God to do something, and therefore you went to something or someone in the world to try and fulfill it?
Yes and no. The first situation that comes to my mind is just before we came to First here in Collingswood. For a variety of reasons, we felt like our time at Trinity was coming to an end, and so we were praying about and asked some people to pray with us about whether God might be leading us to plant a church. And so that whole Lenten season that year, we had people praying with us about that. And by the time we got to Easter Sunday, we're like, all right, I don't hear any answer. I guess we're just staying here another year. And so we didn't feel a strong leading. So when you don't feel a strong leading, you just keep doing what God has told you to do. So we said, all right, I guess we're gonna stay. So this was like Lent of 2021. So
okay.
yeah, Lent of 2021. So we don't get any answer. Kind of come to peace with over that week of we're just going to be staying here. And then that Saturday, the district superintendent called and said, hey, would you be interested in taking a church that's not even in our annual conference? Because they're looking for somebody that, kind of sounds like you, and, we think you might be a good fit, and think about it, pray about it, and let me know by Monday morning. So we start talking about it, and we realize, we don't want to go to that other church. We weren't really looking to leave the area, but it kind of solidified the fact that God was ready for us to move to. It's just what we thought might have been the option wasn't what God had in mind. Mm-hmm. And so instead of going to that other church, we said, well, what about this church in Collingswood that's still open? Would that ever be an option? Or do you think that would be a good fit even? By that afternoon, he met with the cabinet. They talked about it. He called me back the next day and said, yes, we'd like to appoint you there. Thursday night, we met with the SPR here at Collingswood. Saturday morning, we met with the SPR at our former church. And Sunday morning, it was announced in both churches. And so it went from, God, you're not giving us an answer on our timeline on Easter Sunday to 2 Sundays later, it being announced in both churches that
that's wild.
There was going to be a shift and a change and a transition. So, yeah, that's kind of the first one. We didn't turn to something else, but we were frustrated that God wasn't doing what he wanted. But we chose to trust that he was still doing something. And when we let go of our very narrow focused question about, God, are you leading us to plant a church? And gave him the space to say, here's what I want for you next. Mm-hmm. Then he spoke into that situation. So I think that would be my answer. But Jeremy, what about you? Can you think of a situation where you didn't feel like God was operating on your timeline, turned to something else your whole life?
He never does what I tell him to know. I guess I'd go romantic relationship stuff where I know what from scripture and from being raised in the church what I should have desired in a partner, and yet when God didn't provide that, I was like, okay, well then I'll settle on whoever I can convince to date me. That'll be the one. And so, that led into a couple of long-term relationships that thank God I didn't end up staying. Yeah, it just wouldn't have been good for me nor the kingdom. And so, yeah, one of those things where I made that such a priority in my life. Not just the finding them, but then once I had them, then this is who I need to give myself to when God is the one that I needed to give myself to. Mm-hmm. And so that took up time, resources, and emotions, all these things into relationships that if you'd asked me more objectively prior to starting it, it's not the one God wants me to have. Just very thankful that God ended those, even if I wasn't the one that did the breakup, that they ended. And then God not only provided Rebecca into my life, but then opened up my eyes and matured me to a point where I was able to see and accept and all that kind of stuff.
And it's often just that little shift of perspective, isn't it? Mm-hmm. That changes everything. That shift from, oh, the one I'm looking to be with, the one I'm looking to spend time with, oh, that's supposed to be God, not somebody else. Or, oh, I'm not quite asking the right question. My question's too narrow. I'm looking for too specific of an answer. As I was getting ready for this sermon, though, I was listening to a podcast from the Bible Project, and they gave a perspective shift on a story that totally blew my mind. I wanted to just throw it out there to you and see what your initial reaction is. And if you're interested in hearing the actual conversation they have, it was the May 23rd, 2022 podcast from the Bible Project called 2 Takes on the Test at Mount Sinai. In that conversation, they invited another theologian on, Bible scholar, and she was sharing the idea that as we're talking, like we did on Sunday, about the mediating role that Moses played and his intercession and that kind of stuff, that this is really what God has been looking for. And they made the case that when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah, that God wasn't actually wanting him to sacrifice Isaac, which we see in the story, right? He provides the ram. But what if what God was really wanting was for Abraham to stop and say, you know, God, this isn't who you've revealed yourself to be. This isn't the kind of God you've shown yourself to be. Is there another way? What if God was asking Abraham to intercede on behalf of Isaac and the promise that God had made for him, rather than being willing to sacrifice him? And it's almost like Abraham goes through all this and he's ready to stab him. And God's like, whoa. I see you're serious about all this. Like, I see your devotion to me, and I honor that, and here's the ram, like, sacrifice that instead. But what if what God really wanted was for Abraham to stand in the gap?
I need to chew on that one.
Yeah. I'm not saying I'm convinced by it yet.
No. Yeah, no, I definitely need more time to chew on that. I sadly, every time I hear that story, even though we talked about it this past weekend as well, I always get more hyper-focused on what the conversation was like when he got back home to his wife. Yeah. Even within that Abraham story and connecting it to my issue with the relationships, one of the things literally just had, it's wild. Person hopefully listening will know, we were talking on the van ride back from the retreat. I was saying, we were talking about like Colombia and you know, Rebecca and I started a date and then like getting married and stuff. And the most important shift that I had in my walk with God in regards to romantic relationships was the willingness and contentment to be single if that's what God had for me in my life. Not necessarily even a desire to be single, but a trusting that if it's most fruitful for his kingdom for me to be single, then that should also be my desire. His will, not my will, be done. And so I see a lot of this comes back to the cup we were talking about earlier with Lord, take this cup of suffering. A lot of young people are their cup of suffering is the life of singleness and not having that Christian partner to support them and walk with them. And when I've seen in others, when they've gotten to the shift of I'd rather be where God wants me and single than in a romantic relationship that pulls me away from God. they're unstoppable.
Yeah.
They're unstoppable in their walks of faith. They're unstoppable in ministry. And when they do have romantic relationships, it's because it's fruitful for the kingdom. And you just see another depth of fruitfulness to their time together, beyond just, we have fun and they make me blush.
Yeah.
Like, and so that's where I always try and get, and it all again is rooted from the your will be done, not mine, and getting to a point where that's truly our heart's desire in every area of life.
Well, and they've learned, right? They've come to the point where they've learned that God is the one who satisfies those deep needs in our heart, right?
Yeah.
They've learned that his presence is what matters, and to be in a relationship without God's presence in it doesn't matter, right? They'd rather know that they're walking in the presence of God than to have that relationship, and that's a beautiful thing. I wish that the church could get to a better place, and I think we are, but we still have a lot of work to do, where singleness is held up as a valid option.
Yeah.
And it, so much of church life and church culture revolves around couples or families or whatever. I think there is a beauty to that.
Yeah. One less distraction.
Yeah.
And that's what Paul talks
That's what Paul
about.
said, yeah.
Sure. And let me know if we got to cut this part out. But when I talk with our young adults and they talk about like homosexuality issue within the church and, what our church is going through and all that kind of stuff, I don't approve of all straight relationships.
Yeah, sure.
Like if you were to ask me about, I have friends that I don't think that they are with partners that are fruitful for their spiritual life. And if that's not the first fruits, well then like, why? Why is that going to be your main focus and relationship in your life if it's not drawing you closer to God and doing great things for the kingdom? And so even sometimes within the church, it's like, well, it's the first person that goes to church regularly that's ever liked me. And so since they regularly go to church and they like me, then this must be it. This must be the one. Sometimes, ring by spring, we joke about with like Christian colleges.
Yep.
It's like, because they have that title. But if you don't see, I always say, try and look for actions behind the words. Look for transformation from God. Not that they change to make you happy and think that they're more spiritual, but like they're growing on their own with God, and God is the foundation of their life, and you see actions reflecting that rather than I have Bible verses memorized because I grew up in the church, and that makes sense, but I might still cut this out. Scary stuff.
But that's the real stuff, and that's the stuff I think we have to wrestle with as we figure out, what does it mean to speak the gospel, to live the gospel into the culture we live in today?
Yeah.
Because even in our culture, marriage doesn't hold the same place it did 50, 60, 70 years ago. No. And so we have to be willing to wrestle with those things as a church so that we can speak into them and we can walk with people who are walking through those realities.
Yeah. One of the most annoying things for me from the culture, and it's kind of derived from Christian moral ethics of you don't have sex until marriage, and then once you're married, this is the person you have sex with for the rest of your life. And so
which is true. We affirm that.
Yes, and that's leaned into the culture saying, well, shouldn't I test out the car before I buy it?
Yeah.
And like, if this is going to be forever, and this is the only one forever, well then, I gotta make sure that it's enjoyable and pleasurable and whatever it might be. And then you have people saying, oh, well, it didn't feel as I anticipated, and therefore this must not be the relationship, and I need to change and go find someone else and whatever.
Right.
Ask any married person from like, I'd say 5 years, but let's say 10, 30, 50 years, like, was your sex life the core thing holding your marriage together? And if it was, how great of a marriage could that be?
Yeah.
Like, when you're in all the intricacies of what this relationship is, like, it's a holy part of this relationship that God created for us. But it's not the foundation, or shouldn't be the foundation of the relationship it's a part of, but not the foundation. And
Absolutely.
so that's where it's like scary that people have kind of transformed it to look like, or anticipate it to be that.
Well, because I think sex and sexuality has become one of the idols of our age. And so everything is seen through that lens, and we've bought a lie that says I can only be fulfilled as I'm expressing my sexuality to the fullest of whatever I deem that to be.
Yeah.
And so...
And it's beyond complex.
Oh, yeah.
Like it's not just ooh, pretty, I like, and then physically this feels good. Like there's layers of I want to be desired, I want to be loved, I want to fully express, and I can't express in other areas, so I want to explore how I can express myself in this area or whatever it might be. And then wrestling of what you've been told versus what you're trying to go against from your childhood and upbringing. And like there's so many layers to it. It's become a hyper focus within our society, and there's more to life. It brings life, but there's more to it. There's much more to it. And I forget who was preaching about it, but talking about how like a reason why it is so desired personally or even to view is because there's something holy happening, even if it's abused and not how God desired it to be. It's something that's separate from every other experience that physically have.
There's almost, and I say almost, a sacramental aspect to it.
Absolutely.
Right? That's why.
But then you take God out of the equation.
Yeah. But for so long, and that's why for so long, though, the church considered, and the Roman Catholic Church still does, considers marriage a sacrament. Because there is this beautiful mystery that happens in the uniting of two persons in the sexual act.
Yeah. I didn't think we were going to get to sex today.
No, me neither.
No.
But here we are. Well, that's our conversation for today. But that doesn't mean the conversation is over. We'd love to hear your thoughts on these topics as well. To ask a question about anything we've discussed in this episode, or to join the conversation, you can head over to fumccollingswood.org/podcast. Thanks for being part of this conversation.